In this video, we will discuss how to write a constructed response and look at an example constructed response together. First, we'll go through the elements of a constructed response paragraph. The first thing you want to do is begin the paragraph with the topic sentence, which is also your thesis statement for the paragraph. Within that sentence, you want to include the title and the author's name, and include your main idea or argument, which most of the time will answer the question or the prompt that you were given. Your next step is to include textual evidence to support that main idea or argument that you mentioned in your topic sentence. You want to make sure you integrate quotes with an introductory phrase, no dropped quotes. We'll see an example of that in the paragraph. And you want to include in-text citations. You always want to refer to the line number or the page number that you got that text or that quote from. The next element is that you need to explain the textual evidence. After each one of your quotes or your examples, you need a sentence or two where you explain in your own words how that quote relates back to your thesis statement or answers the prompt. What you're really doing is explaining how does the quote/evidence support your point. Then finally, after your 2 or 3 pieces of textual evidence that you've explained, you have your conclusion sentence, where you restate your main argument. Some other helpful tips are that you might want to use transition words between each piece of evidence, and you want to avoid saying I think or I believe. Those phrases can weaken your argument and your answer. It'll make you sound a little bit unsure, so you just want to avoid saying those phrases and instead just get right to the point. Before I give you my constructed response paragraph example, here's an example constructed response question that you might be asked to answer. How does Naomi Shihab Nye's poetry show how a person's identity is formed through culture, heritage, and experience? The poem that I'm going to use to answer this question is below. It's called A Kansas Preacher Called Me Muscle Man. I'm going to read it for you. A Kansas preacher called me Muscle Man, and I was a thin guy, too. Such a joke. Just call me Aziz. He wanted to change me, as is, make me stand up to his own angel songs. I told him, listen, Bethlehem used to be right next door. It was my suburb. I walked there from home as a boy in the pack of pilgrims, burning waxy candles at dawn. They let me trail, opening my mouth, pretending to know their words. If you smell the skin right on my wrist here, you'll detect the scent of rain on stones. Right when you climb down those old stairs to the church, you can come with me if you want to. I think you can hear Jesus cry, too. And I can tell you where the secret door is, into more than one shrine, how far down you'll have to scoop to enter it. But maybe you're too tall and thick. I don't think you could get in there. So next I have an example constructed response paragraph written based on the previous poem and the prompt I read a couple slides ago. Here's the whole paragraph. I'll read it out loud to you, but you might want to pause and read through this paragraph on your own, too. Naomi Shihab Nye's poem, A Kansas Preacher Called Me Muscle Man, suggests that immigrants feel out of place when they are expected to change in order to fit another culture. At the beginning of the poem, the speaker talks about how a Kansas man mispronounces his Palestinian name. Just call me Aziz. He wanted to change me, as is. Lines 2 to 3. The speaker feels that the Kansas preacher wants to change the way his name is pronounced to make Aziz fit the American culture better. In the next few lines, the Kansas man tries to make Aziz stand up to worship songs. Nye writes, I told him, listen, Bethlehem used to be right next door. It was my suburb. Lines 4 through 6. Aziz has his own religious experiences that the Kansas preacher knows nothing about, and instead of learning about those experiences, the preacher makes Aziz conform to his own beliefs and traditions. Finally, at the end of the poem, Aziz describes the stairs into a church in his neighborhood. He says to the preacher, but maybe you're too tall and thick. I don't think you could get in there. Lines 18 and 19. These lines show that the physical differences between the two men also emphasize how different their experiences were. In her poem, Nye shows how immigrants can feel misunderstood when their culture is unfamiliar to those around them. What I'm going to do in the next couple slides is draw your attention to where all of the elements I mentioned at the beginning of the video can be found. So the first thing is my introductory sentence. You'll see that I started out my paragraph with my thesis statement. I mentioned the title of the poem, the author's name, and what I was going to try to argue through the rest of the paragraph. I'm arguing that her poem suggests that immigrants feel out of place when they're expected to change in order to fit into their culture. And my 3 examples should support that point in my thesis statement. The next thing I did was include 3 specific pieces of textual evidence, and those are in the green. You can see I have quotation marks around them so that it's very clear that those come from the poem and they're not my own words. The next element is that I didn't just drop those quotes in there, but I included an introductory phrase. So notice that in that second example, before I used the quote, I said, Nye writes, comma, and then the quote. In the last example, I said, he says to the preacher, comma, and then the quote. I never started out a sentence with a direct quote. That's called a dropped quote, and we want to avoid that. Sometimes you can do a sentence with a colon and then a quote, like my first example. At the beginning of the poem, the speaker talks about how a Kansas man mispronounces his Palestinian name, colon, example, and that works just fine. The next element is in orange, and that is my in-text citations. After every quote, I included what lines that quote or those lines from the poetry were from, so that you could go back and find them in the poem. The pink lines are all my explanation. So after each quote, I have at least one sentence that explains, in my own words, how the quote I used relates back to or supports what my thesis statement says about how immigrants feel out of place when they're expected to change in order to fit into their culture. Finally, at the very end in blue, I have my conclusion sentence where I restated my main point. I also mentioned Nye again, the author, to remind my reader what author I'm talking about. And finally, in white, I have 2 transition sentences. So between my examples, I transitioned from one example to another. I said, in the next few lines, the Kansas man tries to make Aziz stand up to worship songs. And then at the end, I have, finally, at the end of the poem, Aziz describes the stairs into a church in his neighborhood. Those sentences help transition from one example to another smoothly. If you can get all those elements into your constructed response paragraph, you will have a strong, supported constructed response answer.